Hey everybody, I'm Nick Layton.
And I'm Leah Bottima.
And we're the hosts of Were You Raised by Wolves?
Each week we try to make the world a kinder, nicer place.
Well, that's the idea, at least.
I mean, we try.
Have you ever wondered what to do if you're ghosted?
Or what to do when a friend asks you to borrow money?
Or the proper way to eat Cheetos?
You know, the big questions.
So please find Were You Raised by Wolves wherever you listen.
You're listening to Heritage Radio Network.
You're listening to Heritage Radio Network. HRN is food radio supported by you. Learn more at heritageradionetwork.org.
This is Gastronomica, an HRN podcast. I'm your host for today, Bob Valgenti. This series is produced in collaboration with Gastronomica, the Journal for Food Studies. Our spring season continues with conversations featuring authors from our newest issues. Issue 24.1, now available online, showcases new research, creative nonfiction, and artwork on a range of topics, including authenticities, sustainabilities, and commemorations. My guest this week is Hallam Stevens, Professor of Interdisciplinary Studies at James Cook University in Queensland, Australia. He is the author of Life Out of Sequence, a data-driven history of bioinformatics, and Biotechnology and Society, an introduction. He is also co-editor of Postgenomics, Approaches to Life After the Genome, and the forthcoming Crafting Everyday Food, Technology, Tradition, and Transformation in East Asia. His essay, Mammoths, Metabolism, and Metaspecies, Controlling Biological Time in the Regimes of Lab-Grown Protein, appears in the most recent issue of Gastronomica. Thank you for joining us, Hallam, and welcome to the show.
Thanks, Bob. Pleasure to be here.
Great. So why don't we begin with a bit about your background? What are the subjects and themes of your research in general? And then perhaps what drew you ultimately to explore the question of bioengineered meat?
Yeah, thanks. So really, I've come to this come to food and food research in a not a linear path, I guess. So my background is in the history of biology. And a lot of the work I've done, my first book was actually about bioinformatics. So really where computers meet the life sciences. So topics like genomics and other areas of biotechnology where computing and information technologies have been used for all kinds of biological life science kind of work. But from there, I really got interested in a whole lot of ideas around kind of biotechnology more generally, thinking about, for example, genetically modified foods and the history of that. And so that the kind of progression has been from sort of thinking about this from a kind of biotech or biological life science kind of aspect into thinking about how this kind of plays into food and food systems.
And would you say that connection between history and biology and technology is one that for you always had, we might say, a kind of ethical cast to it? Or is that something also that's emerged in this more recent research?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that, yes, certainly there's always been a kind of questions that have to do with ethics, I guess. My take on that has been often to think about ethics as one part of a kind of larger set of ways of thinking about what we should eat, for example. All of these questions that I think are not purely kind of ethical questions, but they're kind of delve into questions of public policy, of governance, of law, of economics in some cases, right? So I think that these have a kind of, I guess I would frame it as a kind of governance kind of aspect, perhaps, or public policy kind of aspect to these questions. That's been, I think something that I've been wrestling with or thinking about for a while. Yeah.
And that's, I think, one of the features of your essay that I really enjoyed is that we begin sort of immersed in the middle of things. And a lot of the work of your essay is very smartly and precisely parsing out some of those details. And sometimes we're confronted with just our kind of everyday reality, and we have to navigate, that broad sense of who we are and how we relate with others, animal others and human others. But then sometimes we're confronted with rather quite extraordinary events. And so maybe that's where I can introduce your essay, and you can tell us a little bit about the particulars of that extraordinary event that captured your attention.
Yeah. I mean, this was just something that when I saw this news last year, came out in April 2023, so almost a year ago, that an Australian company had created a meatball which they claimed was made out of mammoth. I thought this was something too good not to write about and not to think with, right? Not to be able to sort of pick this up and be able to think about what are the consequences of making something that at least is claimed to be an animal that's been dead for or extinct for several millennia. So I think that I've been thinking about kind of novel foods for a little while in different contexts, but this example sort of stuck out at me immediately as something that I had to kind of say something about.
Yeah. So can you help our readers a little bit, or our listeners to, because they can't see the essay on the podcast, because there are wonderful images that also accompany your essay. So can you describe for them the kind of scope and magnitude, both technological and physical, of this meatball?
Yeah, right. So yes, there's a nice image of this meatball. I mean, the iconography here is also kind of important. I think that this meatball is called a mammoth meatball. Well, obviously because it's they claim from a woolly mammoth, but also it is in fact mammoth in size. So this is about a meatball that's maybe about 6 to 8 inches across, an enormous meatball that's placed on this kind of. It looks like it's. If you went to a kind of fancy restaurant, there's kind of a swoosh on the plate of some kind of sauce, and there's a kind of a lid on it, which is being in the image that I've used and that's been circulated quite widely. A lid being kind of lifted off, with kind of smoke kind of circulating around this mysterious looking but giant kind of mammoth meatball. So there's definitely this kind of very kind of almost molecular gastronomy kind of look to this meatball, which I think is kind of an interesting aspect of how it's presented as well.
Yeah, and you describe it, one of the terms you use is that it's monstrous. It's a monstrous meatball. And this is not just about its size, but also perhaps what it represents, because it's not simply just like this wonderful meal being revealed at an expensive restaurant, but it almost has that aspect of, Dr. Frankenstein's monster being, presented to the scientific audience as this both incredible miracle of science, but also this kind of paradigm changing event that's going on. So you pose the question, why make an uneatable meatball? Because it's one that they encouraged no one to eat. In fact, they warned against it. And you say that it's uneatable and monstrous, a product of heightened artificiality that deliberately disrupts the boundaries between experiment and eating. So could you unpack that a little bit for us? I think particularly that boundary between experiment and eating is really kind of fascinating.
Yeah. Well, perhaps it's worth starting with the monstrous, right? I think that the reason I call it monstrous is, as you say, because of the size of this thing. It is the kind of giant for a meatball, but also its hybridity, right? Like Dr. Frankenstein's monster, kind of made out of these different elements, right? So the way in which this was actually developed was to take DNA that has been taken from a database, basically, and reconstruct a kind of mammoth gene, and then insert that into something that is like a cow, basically into a cow protein, and then to basically grow that up in a lab and in a bioreactor. And so we have this kind of hybrid, and that's also the reason why I call it monstrous. But also, I mean, I guess worth explaining a little bit more about why it is, I say, uneatable. I choose not to use the word inedible because has a connotation that, you know, is sort of distasteful, I guess. Whereas I think this is designed in order to be ultimately edible in some sense. But in this specific instance, it would actually be illegal in Australia to eat it. It would be illegal in the Netherlands, where it was unveiled, to eat it. The rules in the US have changed actually since this meatball was introduced, but even in the US, meats require, specific products require approval. So I guess it would still be illegal in the US to eat it. So it is literally uneatable. So we have this thing that we've forbidden to eat, but at the same time, there is all this kind of it's an experiment in kind of both the scientific sense, I think, of a literal something coming out of a lab and trying to make something that's a kind of hybrid between different animals, a woolly mammoth and a cow. But it's also an experiment in kind of taste, right? Even though we can't literally taste it, it's an experiment in trying to see what we can do with kind of the future of eating, right? What will people want to potentially eat? What will they buy? What will they be interested in consuming for kind of ethical reasons? So I think it opens up, and I think this is, you know, the broader industry of kind of lab-grown meats, I think is also experimenting right now with, you know, these different kinds of potential futures of edibility, right? And and I think this is an example of that.
Do you think it's an extreme or even a kind of, you know, absolute break? You know, so when you say a disruption there between experimented eating, in one sense, we can think of this as, you know, something that's never been seen before, and there's a real danger that's involved. And a lot of new technologies oftentimes bring with them that kind of fear. But there's another way in which, you know, disrupting the relationship between experiment and eating is a part of the, you know, the human history of being omnivores and constantly finding ways to find new food sources, either new geographies or to deal with ever-growing populations, et cetera, and so on. So do you see this as a kind of next step, you know, a matter of degree, or is there something that's particularly different about this technology that should make us pause?
Yeah, I think in some sense I want to say hedge a little bit and say both, right? That there's definitely that history that is there, right? That in not only of kind of finding new foods in general, but also the attempt to further kind of make productive and harness the animals and the plants to some extent that we do use for food to the extreme, right? To the extreme, where we put them in, you know, for example, concentrated animal feeding operations, right? And in a sense, try to extract the most kind of both economic but also edible value from them that's possible, right? And I think so. There's a, you know, industrial agriculture. All of this has kind of been it, and so I think in that sense we can see this as a kind of continuum, right? This is also an attempt to extract even more from animals in this case, right? On the other hand, I do think there's somewhat of an interesting moment here in which we actually have, to some extent, this mammoth meatball discards with the conceptual category of the animal itself in some ways, right? So some people have called this cell-grown meats are kind of zombie meats, right? That actually it's a meat that we can get without a brain, right? Like even you know, in concentrated animal feeding operations, as miserable and as kind of subjectified as the animals are, right? They still are whole animals with functioning bodies and brains. But that is not the case here, right? This is a kind of this is a breakdown in which animals have been totally disaggregated into merely parts, and so I think that we could see as something significant, that this isn't really even a mammoth, right? It's a mammoth only in the sense that it's some kind of genetic kind of in a very vague kind of genetic sense, right? It sort of defies the categories that we have had for any animal.
Yeah, and it represents a certain kind of practice, if you will, of beginning with the parts or the components, or thinking that the world is a sort of aggregate rather than perhaps as you know, we touched upon at the very beginning, that we kind of start immersed and we start with the whole, and that those parts and elements are just abstraction. So it really has to do with this way that we relate to the world around us. I think we're at a moment right now where it might be a good time to take a break, but I want to stay on this thought when we come back, because you touched upon this blurred distinction between animals and humans, or how that's become blurred, and I think that fits in nicely with what is HRN's theme for the month of April, which is this notion of borders. So we can talk about some of those borders and how they resonate throughout this essay. So let's take a short break, and we'll be back in just a moment.
HRN needs your help. Become an HRN member with a donation of any amount at heritageradionetwork.org/donate. Through creative, educational reporting, storytelling, and live events, HRN delivers thought-provoking exchanges about the real issues affecting our global food system. Your donation also supports our internship program, an essential part of HRN's work that educates the next generation of journalists. When you become an HRN member at any level, you'll be the first to know about special events and get news updates created only for Food Radio insiders. Help us meet our fundraising goal with your tax-deductible donation. Go to heritageradionetwork.org/donate and become a member today.
And we're back. This is Gastronomica on HRN. I'm Bob Valgenti, talking with Hallam Stevens about mammoths, metabolism, and metaspecies, controlling biological time in the regimes of lab-grown protein. Now available in Gastronomica's Spring 2024 issue. So let's pick up where we left off, and perhaps you can say a little bit more about that distinction between humans and animals, and perhaps how this technology seems at one and the same time both to dissolve that distinction, but also heighten that distinction, because there's a way in which the utilization of animals merely for their component parts as a way to feed ourselves, is kind of absolute technological reduction, draws a rather quite stark line between what it means to be human and everything else that's outside of us that can be manipulated and controlled. So could you discuss that sort of duality that's there in the border a little bit?
Yeah, so I think all kind of eating in a sense kind of involves crossing a kind of border, right? Like we have to bring food into our bodies, right? And this is a kind of if it's an animal that we're consuming, then the animal is crossing this kind of boundary into our bodies. And the way that I guess I talk about this in the paper is through this concept of kind of metabolism. And the idea that there's a kind of cycle or circle here through which we are ingesting these creatures that we have made, right? And that in a sense we're the kind of completion of the kind of metabolic cycle that begins in a kind of lab, but is kind of finished in our own ingestion of the product from that lab. And one of the things that I kind of think that this leads to in this case is that this idea, the idea that the mammoth contains, and that has been articulated by the company Val Foods, who made the meatball, is that this is about actually tweaking the the food that we have in the lab to match our own bodies, right? So that we can actually, before we take something into our body, before we metabolize it, or before we complete that cycle of metabolism, we're able to manipulate it, tailor it to what we kind of need, right, and what we want. So if we want, more of a particular nutrient, right, or if we want even a more kind of ethical animal that doesn't involve killing, then we can kind of tailor it in this way. And so this is a kind of bringing some of that, in some sense, that metabolic process kind of outside into the lab, right? So in a sense, this is this blurring of the boundary, right? Part of the metabolic process occurs sort of in the lab itself, right, or in the bioreactor where the stuff is being created, and then the process is completed as it's kind of ingested into our bodies, right? So, I think that's the kind of promise, in some sense, that Vow Foods wants to kind of offer us.
And I think it seems that in a certain way, those who would promote those technologies, or perhaps this way of kind of seeing that metabolic cycle, would say that in essence, what we're doing at the core, what someone like Vow, what humans who would do this are doing at their core is replicating that metabolic process, expanding it, and that this is really just an extension of life in its many kind of forms. But there's a way in which, as humans, we're always placing value on things, and this is one of the really powerful themes throughout the essay, and one of its organizing principles too, is that you begin with this creation by Vow Foods, which clearly for them is about stretching the technological possibilities to increase, its value as a commodity in a certain sense, or the possibility in the future for this type of commodity of biocultured meats. But of course, it's always cut through with other types of value. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit about the kinds of values that are put in play here, both financial and cultural and social, but then also the temporal value, which is really, I think, the deepest meditation that you give in this whole essay. So maybe we could start with those other ones and then get to that question of time.
Yeah, sure. So, right, this is, and I'm certainly not the first person to kind of articulate this idea about these lab-grown foods, this idea that these are more and more involved in kind of different regimes of kind of economic value that are associated with kind of the biotech industry and all of the kind of speculation in that field. But I think kind of one of the things that I talk about here is the ways in which the mammoth in particular is associated with a kind of value of a supposed value of kind of conservation and the environment and kind of ethics in particular. And Vow articulates that in a very particular way. And they talk about in their kind of marketing how the mammoth, because it died out due to climate change, supposedly thousands of years ago, that this is a particularly good representative of how we might also kind of survive climate change, right? So there's a kind of, they're trying to make a kind of analogy between the mammoth survival, or the mammoth's kind of lack of survival, and our own kind of position where we also need to do something radical about the climate and about our climate sort of situation, right? And one of the ways in which we can do that, they argue, is by eating less meat, right? By eating less meat that comes off a traditional kind of industrial farm, and that industrial agriculture has carbon dioxide emissions that are high, and that by reducing our intake of those kinds of industrial meats, and switching to their product, that we can actually reduce our impact on the environment. And so in some sense, the mammoth becomes a kind of savior, right? The mammoth, although it itself died because of climate change, it can save us, right? So it sort of adopts this kind of almost messianic kind of persona here, right, where it takes on our sins in a way, and becomes the savior for us, right? So it has a value as a kind of climate change symbol.
And I would think too, since as you mentioned, you're a historian of biology, it's also a kind of radical rewriting of history, because we're not reproducing or going back to the history of a kind of coexistence, as you say in the essay, with the mammoth, but we're envisioning, or we're taking out of that historical record and envisioning for our own future a kind of future that dispenses with the very thing they say they're valuing, and that is the kind of environment that could support both mammoths and humans and other types of megafauna that were around at some point in the past.
Yeah, exactly. This requires a radical rethinking of what it means to live with and in sort of codependence with another species, right? This is not the kind of relationship that you have between humans and mammoths on the kind of on the steppe, right? This is one in which mammoths as individual species never exist, right? In fact, they only exist only disaggregated parts of them exist in hybrid forms in a bioreactor in order for us to immediately eat them, right? That's a weird form of existence, if it's existence at all, right? So the mammoth is kind of resurrected, but also not, right?
Yeah. Do you believe this kind of technology, or the sort of fervor for this type of technology, makes climate degradation, and in fact, a kind of apocalyptic environmental scenario, a fait accompli, in the sense that what the technology shows us is that we don't need to coexist with these animals in the types of environments that have existed, because we can feed ourselves completely through technologies. In fact, that might be better in the long run in a certain sense.
Right. I certainly think there's a big risk of that, and I think I talk a little bit in the paper about the de-extinction movement and how that which is also, I think, not coincidentally focused on the mammoth. The mammoth has been a big kind of target of de-extinction, and the idea that we could resurrect, in this case, a living, functioning whole body mammoth, and in fact many mammoths, and we could reintroduce them into the wild. This idea, has also been widely criticized by people who point out that maybe actually this is a kind of distraction, right? That actually perhaps we shouldn't be focusing on reanimating these dead creatures, but focusing on the animals that we still have, and working out how to preserve our planet and preserve environments so that we can keep them, right, and preserve that biodiversity. And I think the same argument applies here, right? Rather than there's certainly a risk that mammoth meatballs and other kind of exotica become a kind of distraction from the main issue, perhaps, which is that we should actually need to radically reduce our intake of meat, right, if we're going to have an impact on the climate. And here, this is kind of saying, well, we don't actually need to do that. We can have our meat because we can just make it in a lab, and still the climate, the mammoth is going to save us, right? This mammoth meatball is going to save us.
Right. And it's sort of written through that shift in value. It's a shift from, we might say, the value that each creature has within a healthy functioning ecosystem towards, a shift towards its sort of utter commodification in a way, or it becomes something that's utile for our own existence, but has no kind of relation with an integrated whole of the environment in some sense. I wanted to, as you were just pointing out, this question of desire is another one that's really, really potent, because many will say that, technology is what helps us to address what is perhaps the most difficult problem to solve, which is human behavior. And that technology becomes, in some sense, a kind of crutch, if you will, to help us where we can't change our ways. So how do you see that issue of if we accept that we can't continue to consume as a species as much animal protein as we are currently doing, because the planet just can't sustain it in that way. If not technology, then what becomes the means of addressing that?
Well, I guess I have a kind of, in some sense, a self-interested view here, right? That I think that us as the collective of kind of social scientists, historians, philosophers, have a much bigger role to play in, I guess, convincing people that actually we're not going to solve the problems through technology, that actually, the people who sit on the kind of non-STEM side are the ones who I think perhaps are able, we deal with behavior. We understand the way societies work, and the way in which we might be able to convince people that in fact we do need to change. We do need to change behavior. We do need to change the way in which we think about our diets. And this is that actually, even if we have, I'm not a total opponent of these kinds of technologies. I think that these technologies perhaps do have a role to play in a kind of broader kind of set of changes, within a kind of broader set of changes in the way that we live on the planet. But I think if the risk of something, again, like the mammoth meatball, is it suggests that we can solve the problem through technology alone. And I think that's the risk, that it suggests that there's a kind of technological fix. And we see this, I think, often in talk about climate change, that there are these kinds of technological fixes where we'll kind of get out of jail free. And I think that's not going to be the way things are going to play out. But in fact, we need technology, yes, but we're going to need serious understanding of society and communities and cultures in order to kind of affect the kind of behavioral change alongside the technological change that we need.
Would you go as far as to say that the desire for meat consumption, perhaps as it's most often portrayed, American culture is a good example of this, Australian culture, I think it has a kind of, there's a powerful imaginary of meat consumption that's there as well. Do you see that as connected to that mindset of using technology to get ourselves out of these problems, that they're actually very closely related, that you're addressing one and the same behavior essentially, and that we're trying to rewire that a little bit, which is this, we might say, a kind of instrumental relationship to the beings and creatures that are around us?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that this is very deeply ingrained in culture, and it's going to be very hard to it's going to be hard to change, right? And I think that's, I live in a place called Townsville, which is Australia's largest live cattle port. And so this is a place where the economy depends in very deep ways on being able to take live animals from these huge cattle stations in the interior of the country and ship them through places like this in order to, for the economy of this whole region is dependent on that. So, and that is, as you say, that has a kind of, in the long term, that has cultural effects, right? The kind of almost, the cowboy mentality, I guess, the sort of the icon of the cowboy in America, but also I think that similar kinds of things here as well. They play that sort of associated with kind of this idea of meat and it's kind of essential. The idea that it's kind of essential for our economy and our lifestyle is very deeply ingrained. And I think, that goes. I think the desire to kind of defend that through technology, I think, is very much a part of what's going on.
Yeah, and it's a difficulty that resonates throughout, what we might say are all the different modes of transition towards, future economies and future societies, because we oftentimes think, well, the technological problems are the biggest hurdles to overcome, and those are what are going to challenge us the most. But it might be those cultural changes that accompany them that are the ones that are provide us with the most stress and perhaps the greatest challenge. So I'm wondering if, as we move towards the end of our time together, you can maybe share with us what surprised you the most as you wrote this and reflected on this moment in technological history and biological history.
I guess what surprised me was how much this resonated with so many of the themes that I guess in the history of biology in some ways, with this ideas about metabolism, these ideas about kind of deep time, these ideas about kind of our relationship to other species, right? In some sense, what surprised me is how this single technology kind of opened up all of these different kind of themes, which I thought was kind of fun to kind of explore in this paper. So that's what I kind of inspired me to do this, and I had a fun time kind of thinking and kind of writing about this.
Yeah, no, it was something that was really palpable to me as I was reading the essay, and as someone who teaches ethics and I'm currently teaching sustainability transition, I said, well, this is perfect article to share with students because it gives them just enough and it opens up the right questions that will certainly spark discussion, and it allows individuals from various backgrounds to kind of find that element within the problem that's perhaps most pressing for them, because it is a pretty complex and like the technology itself, somewhat hybrid, and stresses us across all those different borders and boundaries. So maybe as a way of finishing up, can you tell us what's next for you in terms of your research?
Yeah, so in some ways, I actually started thinking about this in Singapore, in the context of Singapore, which was the first place to basically make these meats available for human consumption. And so part of what I want to do is actually go back to that context and think about a little bit more and what's happening there and the way in which that's playing out. Asia is such a huge market. It's going to be such a huge and growing market for these foods. Everywhere from fish in Japan to the growing markets in China. And so Singapore is planning to play a big role in that. And so I'm interested in following up on what's happening in that context.
Great. It sounds exciting. And I want to thank you so much for being a part of the podcast today.
Thanks. Pleasure.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Listeners will be able to read the full article in Gastronomica, the Journal for Food Studies, issue 24.1. For more details, visit gastronomica.org. This concludes our spring series of podcasts. We will return for HRN's summer season. In the meantime, we encourage you to subscribe to the Gastronomica podcast feed on your favorite platform to stay updated on our newest episodes.
This show is powered by Simplecast. Thanks for listening to Heritage Radio Network, food radio supported by you. Keep in touch at heritageradionetwork.org/subscribe.
I want to tell you about a new podcast called Amuse News. Publishing multiple days a week, Amuse News is your source for food news, interviews from around the food world, and more. On the show, we'll be engaging with food storytellers, from chefs to advocates to people working in the field, and many more. Find Amuse News wherever you get your podcasts. Amuse News is a destination for everyone who's looking for a new, insightful look into the world of food.